I will also aim to describe the phases of motor development according to these very, very important theoretical models, and explain how the requirements of the movement task, the biology of the individual, and the conditions of the learning environment all interact together with the triangulated hourglass model of motor development. All right, so before we proceed that actually complement one another, we need to bear in mind that motor development occurs in an orderly sequence as infants move from reflexive reactions, for example, sucking and rooting, to more advanced ones, or to more advanced motor functioning. So for instance, babies first learn to hold their heads up, then they attempt to sit with assistance and help, then they learn to sit more independently or unassistedly, followed later by crawling, pulling up, cruising, and then walking. So as motor skills develop, there are certain developmental milestones that our young children should achieve. For each milestone, there is an average age as well as a range of ages in which the milestone should be reached. An example of a developmental milestone is a baby holding up its head. And we'll actually look at those milestones when we actually dive a little bit deeper into the theoretical frameworks that we'll be looking at today. Babies on average are able to hold up their heads at about an average of 6-week-old stage. And 90% of babies achieve this between 3 weeks and 4 being as 4 months old babies. So if a baby is not holding its head by 4 months or so, he or she might actually be showing a motor developmental delay. On average, most babies sit alone at about 7 months of age because sitting involves both coordination and muscle strength, and 90% of our babies achieve this milestone between 5 and 9 months old. If the child is displaying delays on several milestones, this is reason for concern, of course, and the parent or the caregiver should discuss this with the child's pediatrician as soon as possible. Remember what we discussed about early identification, and this is the same with motor developmental delays as well. Some developmental delays can be identified and addressed through early intervention. So this is why early intervention and identification is very, very important in order for us to avoid any potential severity or regression in what we may be suspicious of. So as you can see, I've just provided a little bit of an idea in terms of what a child with typical motor development actually looks like in terms of their physical movement and coordination, despite having to be assisted since they are still infants at that stage, and those infants that actually may already be showing signs and symptoms of particular physical developmental delays. So motor development occurs in an orderly sequence, and we'll look at that very, very carefully through the theoretical approaches. As infants move from reflexive reactions, such as sucking and rooting, and to those that are more advanced in nature. All right, so the first one that we're going to be looking at, or rather the first theoretical approach that we will actually be looking at, all right, is the Hourglass model by Gallahue, right? This particular model is one of the most popular models of describing the stages of motor development and how they intend to take place and how they link to one another and how they scaffold with one another. And so this theoretical model is quite an old one, but up until today, quite one of the most relevant theories that can actually assist and aid us in understanding how motor development should take place from birth right onto adulthood and elderlyhood. So if you have a look, Gallahue used an hourglass image to actually show us how Gallahue actually describes motor development to take place. So the theory pretty much, or the first stage, starts off from a 4 month of age to a 1 year old of age. and in utero in 4 months old of age. And this is what we've known as the reflexive movement phase. All right, and in the reflexive movement phase, we've got two types of substages. It is the information decoding and the information encoding. Please ensure that you know the differences between the two and know the substages of each particular phase, as each phase does actually have substages in it. So one of the important aspects that you need to remember about this theoretical model is precisely the fact that despite that there are main phases that need to take place, within those phases, certain stages need to take place in order for these phases to be completed when a child matures and physically develops his or her motor functioning skills. Then followed by the reflexive movement phase is the rudimentary movement phase. And this phase is usually associated and should be evident and should take place any time between 1 or 2 years of age. All right. And obviously, if you have a look, the reason why you have these particular stages is that if you have a look at my cursor, please be aware that, for example, if we look at the reflexive movement stage, the information encoding stage should take place in utero up until 4 months of age. All right, the information decoding stage only takes place after the encoding stage, which is after 4 months to 1 year of age. Followed then by the rudimentary phase. When the child enters into this phase, remember that the child first undergoes reflex inhibition stage and then the precontrol stage. And the reflex inhibition stage therefore follows through right from birth to 1 year old, right? And therefore the pre-controlled stage follows on from the age of 1 to 2 years of age. Then the fundamental movement phase takes place later on, which is made up of initial stage, elementary, and mature stages. The initial stage of the fundamental movement phase takes place and is known to take place between the age of 2 to 3 years, followed by the elementary stage of the fundamental movement phase, which is associated with 4 to 5 years of age, and the maturity stage associated between the age of 6 and 7 years. Then we finally move into the final stage of the hourglass model, which is known as the specialized movement phase, which is also made up of 3 substages. The first one takes place in transition, then in application, and then the utilization throughout a lifelong, longer period of time. And obviously the transitioning takes place from 7 to 10 years of age. Thereafter, the application stage from the transitional stage is associated with the age of 11 to 13 years. And of course, lifelong utilization stage takes place from the age of 14 and up. Okay, so although we've got a nice hourglass model, right, all of these aspects, all right, are pretty much there and assist in the development in order for the individual to be able to utilize their motor functioning skills, abilities, and development as a whole in order to achieve lifelong living utilizations, in order to achieve recreational skills and abilities, as well as competitive skills and abilities. And this all takes place throughout early, middle, and late adulthood. Okay, so let's take a look at the first period of Gallahue's hourglass model. When we refer to the first period, remember, we start off with the reflexive movement phase. And this particular phase, of course, remember, is made up of 2 stages, starting with the information encoding stage that starts off right even before birth, up until 4 months of age. So let's take a look at that. When we are looking at reflex, the name of the stage itself focuses on reflexes, all right? And these reflexes are pretty much very sudden and involuntary, and rather more so than ever uncontrolled movements that appear in response to specific stimulus. Even those reflexes still taking place in the mother's womb. These behaviors are very much controlled by the lower centers of the brain, such as the spinal cord and the brainstem, which we looked at in quite a little bit in detail in Unit 1. And according to Gallahue, the reflexive phase of motor development is obviously divided into our 2 overlapping stages. known as the information encoding, right, which is more relevant right before birth up until 4 months of age, which is, in other words, the information encoding stage, and the overlapping information decoding or processing stage, which overlaps, all right, with the information decoding stage thereafter and carries out through 1 year of age. So the information decoding stage, which is our first initial stage of motor development, right, is a reflexive movement phase which is characterized by observable involuntary or uncontrollable movements or movement activities during the fetal period, right, until about the 4th month of infancy. So during this stage, the lower brain centers are more highly developed than the motor cortex and are essentially in command of fetal and neonatal movement in the mother's womb. These brain centers are capable of causing involuntary reactions to a variety of stimuli of varying intensity and duration. These reflexes at this point serve as the primary movements by which the infant is able to gather information, seek nourishment from mom, and find protection through movement while still in the womb. Right? However, our reflex movement phase doesn't only end at the information encoding stage, right? But it overlaps, and then the decoding or the information decoding processing stage overlaps with our information encoding stage, in that the reflex phase begins around the 4th month. And during this time, there is a gradual inhibition of many reflexes as higher brain centers now continue to develop. So the infant's development of voluntary control of skeletal movements involves processing sensory stimulus with stored information and not just reacting to stimuli as the fetus reacted initially in the information encoding stage. Okay, so now that we are aware of what takes place in the reflexive movement phase, right, of the Hourglass model of motor development, right, and how these particular stages, right, allow for certain reflective movements to take place and develop further, the rudimentary stage thereafter follows, all right, and the rudimentary stage is associated with birth right up until the 2 years of age, also made up of 2 substages, which we will look at now. The rudimentary movements are the first forms of voluntary movement that are seen in the infant beginning at birth at about the age of 2 years. The nature of these maturations lie determined and is characterized by a highly predictable sequence of appearance. So, in other words, rudimentary movements are pretty much basic forms of more advanced movement in the latter, and are divided into 3 categories. Please know these categories very, very well. So there are 3 categories in those rudimentary movements that we begin to see from birth right up until the age of 2. We see stability movements, such as gaining control of the head, the neck, and the trunk, and moving these parts of the body in coordination. Manipulative tasks, such as reaching, grasping, releasing. Alright, so you can actually see that in the hands quite often in our little ones, in our babies, and the locomotor movements, which involve creeping up, crawling, and walking, or attempting to walk or learning to walk. So the rudimentary movement phase of development is, and now going back to these substages, the precontrol and the reflex inhibition stage. All right, the rudimentary movement phase of development is subdivided into 2 stages that represent progression of higher order of motor development, control skills, and abilities. The first stage is known as the reflex inhibition stage, and followed by thereafter the precontrol stage. So, after the information decoding stage, pretty much the reflex inhibition stage enters into phase. And the reflex inhibition stage continues to take place right from birth to about the age of 1 year or so. And in this stage, development of the cortex, the lessening of certain environmental constraints, causes of several reflexes to be inhibited, and gradually disappear. Primitive and postural reflexes are replaced by voluntary movement behaviors, which are what we mean controlled movement behaviors. As we had with the reflexive movement phase, remember that these were uncontrolled and involuntary reflexes that were pretty much reacting to very, very basic stimuli in survival, particularly starting from or before birth in the mother's womb, whereby now during the rudimentary movement phase, now these reflexes are more controlled, right? So movements through purposeful, all right, although purposeful or controlling, in other words, appear uncontrolled and unrefined. They still need to be refined. They still need to be worked on. All right, although we are getting there, we are not there as yet. All right, and if the infant wishes to make contact with an object, there will be global activity of the entire hand, wrist, arm, shoulder, and even trunk. So you would see all of these parts attempting to actually interact and get a hold of this object, instead of actually utilizing only certain bodily parts in order to adequately grasp and interact the object. So we can see these controlled movements, but they haven't been refined as yet, right? So the process of moving the hand into contact with the object, although voluntary, therefore lacks control. Right. So apart from the reflex inhibition stage, then the pre-control stage follows through. And that takes place from the age of 1 to 2 years. And around the age of 1, our children begin greater precision and control of their movements. The process of differentiation between sensory motor systems and integrating perceptual and motor information into more meaningful incongruency as a whole begins to take place. So during the pre-control stage, our children learn to gain and maintain the equilibrium, meaning balance, right? To manipulate objects a little bit better as they didn't do so well during the reflex inhibition stage, and to move throughout the environment with an amazing degree of proficiency and control, considering the short time they have to develop these abilities. So you can actually see that there's quite fast-paced growth taking place there. So overall, at this stage, as a result of perceptual and cognitive development, movements are performed with more precision, with more control, and more proficiency. So now that we've looked at what happens in the reflexive movement phase through the information encoding stage and the information decoding stage, followed by the reflex inhibition stage and then the pre-control stage, where we now see better proficient and precision movement as our children enter and take place in the rudimentary movement phase, then we have something called the fundamental movement phase. I'm just sorry, guys. I'm just going to reshare my screen. There we go. And the fundamental movement phase is made up of 3 substages. So like we had the reflection and the rudimentary, each of those 2 primary or initial stages were made up of 2 substages. Now that the fundamental movement phase and our children enter into the fundamental movement phase of their development, they go through 3 substages: the initial, the emerging, and the proficient stage. But we'll get to that just now. The fundamental movement patterns are pretty much quite basically observable patterns of behavior. They become more clear for us. We can actually see the precision movements and the development of the stage of movement and motor development there much better than the reflexive movement stage and the rudimentary. So locomotor activities like running, jumping, manipulative activities, throwing, catching, and your stability activities like walking on a beam, maintaining that equilibrium that we can clearly already pick up during the pre-control stage, is now more proficient, more stable. For example, 1 foot jumps, balances, These are all pretty much what we know as fundamental movements that should develop during the early childhood years, particularly starting from the pre-control stage of the rudimentary movement and moving on to the fundamental movement phase. So the conditions of the environment, in other words, depending on the opportunities that our children have within a particular environment, encouragement, instruction, support, and the context of the environment play an extremely important role in the level to which the fundamental movement skills develop. So in performance and learning of these abilities and movement patterns, there are age-related differences. So here we can, because we can observe these very precise and more proficient movements in much better ways, we can now actually pick up which children might actually be slightly delayed in this particular area of their motor development and which perhaps are keeping on track. So Gallahue views the entire fundamental movement phase as having separate but often overlapping stages, which were the initial, the emerging, and the proficient stages. So during the movement, the fundamental movement phase, our children first go through the initial stage. All right, and usually the initial stage, as you can see, takes place between the age of 2 to 3 years. So in between the age of 2 to 3 years, the child's first goal-orientated attempts at performing involves quite essential fundamental skills. And movements are characterized by missing or improperly sequenced parts, markedly restricted or exaggerated use of the body, and poor rhythmical flow and coordination. Some children may be beyond this level in the performance of some patterns of movement, but most are actually in the initial stage. So we can still see that there are areas of improvement because we can still see perhaps that, you know, the body movements, all right, are there. However, they are not precise. They have not been adapted and mastered during the initial stage. However, we can see that the movements are directed at a particular purpose. All right. However, there are still gaps, and those particular gaps are usually your rhythm flow, your coordination, exaggerated or very withdrawn and restricted body movements. It varies according to our children, of course. All right. Missing or improperly sequences of body movements as well. Then the emerging elementary stages follow through, all right? And this particular substage of the fundamental movement phase pretty much overlaps with the initial stage, all right? And is usually where we can pick up between the ages of 4 and 5 years. And this particular elementary stage, or what we know as the emerging elementary stage, involves gaining greater motor control and rhythmical coordination of fundamental movement skills. So now children are actually able to try and gain control, perhaps of the improperly sequences of their movements, the exaggerated or perhaps the more isolated or the restricted use of body movements, the poor rhythms, and they want to try and improve that. And that is actually physically observable. So patterns of movement during these stages are very much restricted or exaggerated, although they are much better coordinated. Because, like I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, now we can see our children trying to attempt to try and better coordinate these movements. And usually these attempts shown by our children are usually during the emerging elementary stage of motor development. Followed by that, which overlaps with the emerging elementary stage, is the proficiency stage. And this particular stage within the fundamental movement phase is characterized by mechanically efficient, coordinated, and controlled performances. So that improvement, that attempt to improve those movements, obviously we can actually see taking place in emerging, and now from those attempts we can see the results very much observable and evident in the proficient stage. And the proficient fundamental skills that are involved are usually more mature, right? And with continued opportunities, support for practice, encouragement, positive acknowledgement, and instruction, They will continue to improve in terms of the product components of how far or fast, how many, and how accurately they actually take place. Right, so now that we looked at sorry, we looked at the fundamental movement phase, and we looked at these overlapping stages, starting from the initial to the elementary to the mature stage. We then move into the specialized movement stage. And like the fundamental movement phase, we have 3 sub-stages, all right, that follow, which is the transitional, the application, and the lifelong. The specialized movement phase, which is pretty much the 4th and the final formal phase of motor development, is a stage or a phase or a period or a time when fundamental stability, locomotion, and manipulative skills are progressively refined. They are combined and they are elaborated upon for use of increasingly demanding situations, such as daily living, recreation, and sports pursuits. And the onset and the extent of skill development within the specialized movement phase pretty much depend on a variety of tasks, individual and environmental factors, and how well our children have been exposed to these opportunities. Reaction time and movement speed, coordination, body types, height and weight, customs, culture, peer pressures, and emotional makeup are just a few of these constraining factors that can impact the degree in terms of how well these movements actually develop and assist in daily living, recreation, and other pursuits. And just like the fundamental phase, the specialized movement phase also undergoes 3 very basic, or rather specialized substages, known as the transition, from transition to application, and therefore application utilizes and assists with lifelong utilization. So during the transition stage, all right, so if we have a look at the transition stage, okay, this usually becomes very much observable and evident any time between the ages of 7 and 10 to 10 years of age. So during this particular transitional stage, our learners begin to combine and apply important movement skills to the performance of very specialized skills. For example, in extramurals, in sports and recreational settings and activities. For example, walking on a rope, or working on a rope bridge rather, jumping ropes, playing kickballs are just very, very common examples of common transitional skills. The transitional movement skills contain the same elements as the fundamental movements, but with greater form, with more accuracy, with more adaptation and practice and control. And the transitional skills are application of fundamental movement patterns, which are somewhat more complex and more refined, more specific in their form. This stage is quite an exciting time for parents, for our teachers, as well as for our learners, because they're actively involved in the discovery, the combining of numerous movement patterns when they are engaging in more specific and more directed movements, activities, and tasks. So parents, teachers, school-based support team members, all the proximal key role players involved with our children, with our youth, can actually see the progression of the transition stage taking place quite observably and evidently. All right, which actually can help teachers but also help children increase their motor control and movement competence, particularly those that might have been identified that perhaps there are some certain challenges during this transition phase, which goes back to the point of early identification. So followed after the transitioning phase, all right, is then what we call the application stage. And usually the application stage, now the transition and refinement of very specific movements and physical development has taken place, we need those specific movements to now be applied more precisely and succinctly. And usually we see this taking place between the age of 11 and 13 years of age. And this is what we call the application. Now putting these precise, well-refined, adapted physical development and movement, and now putting them into practice. And so this is why they refer to it as the application stage. And during the application stage, there is increased cognitive sophistication and a broadened experience, which enables our learners to make numerous learning and participation decisions based on a variety of tasks, individual and environmental factors. Here, the cognitive aspect is stressed quite often, as our children now decide what they will take place in. They are able to reason why such physical movements, reactions, responses are well coordinated, and how they can reason in terms of when to use them, how to use them, where to use them, and with who to use them with. And in this stage, our learners begin to seek out, or alternatively, to try and stay away or to avoid participation in specific activities. And of course, this is on, again, quite a large emphasis on the cognitive aspect, and this involves more coordinated decision making. There's quite a lot of emphasis also on form, skill, accuracy, and obviously the quantitative aspects of movement performance. This is a time for more complex skills still to be worked through, to be adapted and to refine, and to be used in more advanced activities like games, leading activities, and selected sports activities. Followed by the lifelong utilization stage. This is where we can see the specialization of all of the stages now taking place in this particular stage. And pretty much we can actually now see this going from the age of 14, moving on to young adulthood, middle adulthood, and later adulthood. The lifelong stage represents the pinnacle of the process of motor development, and it is known or characterized by the use of one's acquired movements repertoires throughout life. The interests, the competencies, the choices that are made during the previous stages are carried over in the stage. They are further refined, worked through, mastered, and applied to a lifetime of daily living activities, recreational activities, and sports-related activities. Factors such as available time and money, resources, equipment, facilities, physical and mental limitations have a quite huge effect on this stage. Among other things, one's level of activity participation pretty much depends on a lot of talent, the opportunities that are open for the individual or for the learner, the physical condition of the learner at that point, and the personal motivation. How motivated is the learner to now take these specialized abilities and skills and put them into use? In essence, the lifelong utilization stage pretty much shows us a culmination of all the previous stages and phases. It should, however, be viewed as a continuation of a lifetime process. Okay, so now that we've briefly looked at the hourglass model, starting from the bottom up, although remember that we've got an hourglass model which can be taken and turned around. All right, we have something called the triangulated hourglass lifespan model. All right, and in your content, of course, they discuss it in quite a lot of detail, but in the lifespan model, the age ranges for each phase of motor development should be viewed as general guidelines, not something that should be very, very strictly observed and stuck to, as this can also create other consequences and other biases regarding what is expected to develop at a particular stage. All right. So individuals often function at different phases depending on their experiences, their backgrounds, their genetic makeups. So for example, It is actually possible for a 10-year-old to function in a specialized movement phase at the lifelong utilization stage in stability activities involving a lot of gymnastic movements, but only still be at the elementary stage of the fundamental movement phase in actually manipulating and demonstrating locomotor skills such as throwing, catching, or running. So the triangulated lifespan model actually encourages a little bit more flexibility. And although we should actually encourage a very precautious behavior, for example, with the example that I've given you with the learner having excellent ability in gymnastic movements and skills, all right, we should be able to encourage this behavior for this learner in gymnastics so that the learner still is able to catch up on his or her age mates in the other areas that require development, so that these development levels are still being able to develop and not place a lot of emphasis on other aspects of these development in these stages. So it is very important for us to gather facts about the process of developing motor skills. So the what we call the triangulated model, right, is also known as what we call a heuristic device. And the heuristic device is pretty much the triangle that you are seeing, particularly focused on the important stage or the lowest stage of the hourglass model. Right? So in looking at the triangulated hourglass, okay, is to use it as a heuristic device for conceptualizing, describing, and explaining the process of motor development, but to also take into consideration other aspects, and not to merely for us to look at these stages in isolation, all right, but to keep in mind that heredity and environment also play very, very important factors into our motor development. So to understand this particular model, which is pretty much a more of an adaptation of the hourglass, all right, model proposed by Gallahue, is for me to ask you to picture yourself or to see yourself as an hourglass. So imagine yourself as the hourglass that you're seeing on the screen. And into your hourglass, we need to place the stuff of life, which is the sand. Okay? The sand gets into your hourglass from two different containers. The one is your heredity container, and the other, your environmental jug or your container. So the hereditary container has a lid, and at conception, all right, our genetic makeup is determined and the amount of sand in the container is fixed, right? We all know that. However, the environmental container has no lid, and sand may be added to the container and to your hourglass. We could reach down into the sand pile, for example, like the environment, and get more sand to put into your hourglass. The two buckets of sand signify that both of the environment and the hereditary influence the process of actually signify the process of development. And so the relative contributions of each have been a volatile topic and a debate for years, and it will continue to be of debate. Arguing the importance of each is a meaningless exercise because sand is funneled from both containers into your hourglass. And so when we actually conclude and looking at this particular triangle, it doesn't really matter if your hourglass is filled with hereditary sand or environmental sand. But what is important is that somehow sand gets into your hourglass, and this is the stuff of life. It is the product of both heredity and environment. Okay, so if we go back, we need to take those two buckets into very important consideration, because these actually affect the factors, or they act as constraining factors in our environment when we are developing from a physical, fine motor, gross motor developmental standpoint. Just like we have constraining factors of the environment, we also have the constraining facts of, or constraining factors within the individual. Remember within the example that I provided when we looked at motivation, right? So in other words, motivation is a heredity aspect. Does particularly the learner at a particular stage have the motivation to achieve the next stage? And if the learner doesn't have the motivation, what resources in the environment should be utilized in order to assist with that motivation so that development still takes place? Whether delayed or not, still takes place and progresses. And so this is very important for us to consider, as this is what is able for us to take into consideration when we are able to identify whether learners actually show us developmental delays in their motor development, and not just for us to focus on these stages alone, but take into consideration other very important factors. So apart from the triangulated hourglass, right, we have something that complements, differs, yet links to the hourglass model and its triangle, or the triangulated hourglass model put together. And this is what we call the mountain metaphor model, right? Which is very, very cool. Quite an interesting model because it envisions humankind collectively. Unlike the hourglass model, all right, it sees development, motor development in stages and expected stages for us to be able to determine how well movement, motor development is taking place. However, the mountain metaphor model now takes into consideration the triangulation, putting in the fact of internal and external factors like individual-based, environmental-based factors, and now adding on to that. And so the developers who are Clark and Metcalfe rightfully developed this model, contending that we each climb our own mountains at different phases, capabilities, and abilities. And interestingly enough, our own individual mountains vary. Some of our mountains are very high, some are a little bit lower, some are a little bit wider, some are a little bit narrower, right? In this range of our mountains, however, the individual as the mountaineer, in other words, whoever is climbing the mountain, is seen as a non-linear self-organizing adaptive organism, right? Who climbs, tries to get through to that mountain as highly as possible. How high she or he climbs, which is pretty much our ultimate goal, is dependent on the interaction between our biology. So if we have a look, depends on the heredity, according to the hourglass model, and the conditions of the environment, right? Which is the other bucket in the triangulation, of the hourglass model. So serving as a framework for understanding, the mountain heuristic device, much like the triangulated hourglass, attempts to describe both the products and the processes of motor development. So the two appear to differ, however, from the collective framework of each person having his or her personal mountain to climb is pretty much associated the same way as having each and every one of us to fill our own hourglasses. So the mountain may be seen as an open system that is more dynamic in terms of shape, size, number, the complexity. For example, whereas the hourglass could be viewed inappropriately, as they believe, as a closed and static system that has a one-size-shape-fits-all view of development. So, please ensure that you know the mountain of motor development. Sorry, I just need to correct that so that I don't confuse you. There we go. So if we have a look at our mountains, no matter how high, no matter how well-rounded or more narrow they are, Clark and Medcliffe say that each of us has a good base where the mountain stands on, and from that base, our mountains strengthen. And in that strengthening, there are certain peaks that develop. And we want to try and climb and see how we can climb those peaks. And so we start with reflexive, we start with pre-adaptive, we start with fundamental, we continue with fundamental, sorry, then we move on to context-specific, skillfulness, and then we compensate. And obviously, this is the developmental time. So it takes us time to climb that mountain. But let's take a look at the periods. And what I will do is I will try and link or differentiate now between the mountain model and the hourglass model so that you can see how they tend to link to one another yet differ at the same time. Okay, here we go. See, just want to remove this for us and put this guy over here for us. Okay, so the first thing that you need to have very good knowledge of and you need to know for your upcoming exam and for your future teaching practice is that the mountain of motor development is very dynamic and it highlights the essence of both biology and environment in driving change across 6 phases of development, which we looked at. If you look at my cursor, we started from the reflexive, going on to the pre-adaptive, moving on to the fundamental motor patterns, continuing on to the context-specific, getting into the skillful, and therefore using compensation. So if we start at the basic, at the soil, at the base, at the rocky foundation of our mountain, right? This particular reflexive period is characterized by our beginning to learn the ways of the world, which includes pretty much the approximately 3 months of the prenatal state, as well as the initial weeks following from birth, right? Even though many infant reflexes will continue to flourish throughout the first year or more of life. This period is essential for survival, protection, seeking nourishment, gaining nourishment, and so forth, while still in the womb, and cognitive, intellectual, as well as motor development. They state that although these infant reflexes initiate and facilitate the infant's interaction with the world, they can impede future development if they endure too long. In normal healthy infants, these reactions gradually fade away or disappear across the first year of life. In children who, however, are developmentally delayed, these reflexes can persevere, slowing the normal rate of development. Because these reflexes are still present even after birth, all right, they are unable to give easier way to the remaining movements that now need to take over, and therefore climbing the mountain into the pre-adapted stage might take a little slower than expected. So apart from the reflexive period, right, so if we have a look at the reflexive period going into the triangulated model, remember that we had information and if we had information encoding and decoding. All right, so we still know that according to the hourglass, there were reflexes. However, it was more stage-based, rather than acknowledging that although certain reflexes, particularly those that cannot fade away as they need to in order for them to proceed to the rudimentary stage, the mountain actually says that it might be a little bit of a delay, but it does not necessarily mean that they won't fade away. It just means that the climbing will take a little bit slower than expected. So after this reflexive stage, we move on to the pre-adapted stage, right? And now we are slowly being able to move into the pre-adapted period. And this is where we now see voluntary movements. So if you look at the hourglass, we had what we called involuntary movements. All right. As with the mountain, we also had involuntary in the reflexive period. However, the pre-adapted period says, yes, for some children, there might still be evident and observable, uncontrollable, involuntary movements, but they still will be able to move into the pre-adapted, all right? However, at their own slower pace. And so the emergence of voluntary movements in the pre-adapted period in our mountain, right, focuses on more controlled movements and controlled reflex movements. And so the term pre-adapted has been selected to show the emergence of our motor skills as we overcome the early constraints, such as genetic limitations, gravitational forces, environmental limitations, and so forth, particularly that have a confounding effect on our movement, whilst learning to function in our gravity-bound environment. As part of this process, we do actually and gradually gain increasingly independent functioning, including the ability to move somewhat selectively throughout our space. So through a progression of movement behaviors that often begin with maintaining control of our own head and neck, we gradually gain greater control of the upper body, our hips, our legs and feet, until we can sit, until we can stand and walk independently and posturally correctly. Similarly, during this period, reaching and grasping behaviors emerge as a part of an intricate interaction between our gradually developing postural ability, which is overall an evolving interaction between arm and hand coordination, actions, and our visual control. So Clark and Metcalfe state that the pre-adaptive period is culminated by our ability to feed ourselves, right? So it's not just now about mere survival. Our movements are more coordinated, and we're able to dictate and control our survival thereof, particularly in the pre-adapted period, such as feeding ourselves and walking. Obviously, self-feeding is greatly dependent on our emerging eye-hand coordination, just as walking is dependent on our evolving postural control. So with regard to the topics mentioned above, it appears that most of the concepts discussed in the pre-adapted period of the mountain of motor development are compatible with the rudimentary phase of the hourglass model. Okay, so if we have a look at our hourglass model, we are here, where we can see that we are now progressing from involuntary to more voluntary and controlled movements. So they complement each other at that stage. However, there is a difference that the formulation and depiction of movement shapes in the hourglass model is more regular and realistic. It is more structured and to the point, whereby in the mountain framework, it is more open for more flexibility. So once we are now able to control our movements, particularly those coordinated movements for adequate survival in the pre-adapted period, we then slowly transition into what we call as the fundamental motor pattern period, which is here. Now, of course, climbing higher, right? These particular movements, they start off during infancy, but will endure throughout childhood for most of our children. As in all periods of the mountain of motor development, many factors affect the rate, the breadth of acquisition of movement skills. So, for example, some of our children may have ample opportunity to experience a variety of movements. Some may even have the luxury of high quality instruction supplemented by appropriate amounts and types of practice. Others, however, may have limited opportunities, limited chances to partake in such activities, making the ascent up the mountain more arduous, or what we know as more diverse, more flexible, right, and more different and more unique for every individual. So this period of development includes fundamental locomotor skills, which include running, walking, jumping, hopping, etc., and fundamental object control skills, all right, such as throwing, kicking, as well as catching, trapping, and both types of movement, which pretty much involve into object projection and object interception, right, actually require a lot of levels of interaction between the environment and the mover. So for us to be able to have good exposure to these, right, at this stage, we need to have experience as we are climbing up the mountain. The less we are exposed to such opportunities and skills, the more difficult it would be for us to essentially get to where we want to in terms of our motor development. So these abilities are all a function of skill development in previous periods of the ascent up the mountain. So in other words, as we're moving up the mountain, we are growing and progressing in motor skills and development. This period of development also includes fine motor manipulation, which we also refer to as fine motor skills, all right, which include manipulation, cutting with scissors, handwriting, drawing, eating, using of spoons, chopsticks, or playing certain musical instruments, for example, playing a piano or a guitar. Here again, achievement in this area is greatly affected by the experiences and accomplishments earlier on in the mountain, in the reflexive and pre-adapted periods in particular. So fundamental patterns period are essential, are quite important, and pretty much establish the basis for future movement endeavors. Hence, skill development at this point of the journey up the mountain can be considered as base camp, to which the performer may want or need to return from time to time in order to gain more practice, so in order to gain more strength, and then climb up until the context-specific part of the mountain. So the fundamental patterns period in the mountain of our motor development metaphor framework are actually adaptable with fundamental movement skills in our hourglass model, and reflect the same concept, so that both Clark and Metcalfe and Gallahue introduced fundamental movements as a basis for future skills that use in throughout life. So if we have a look at the fundamental movement skills, where was the fundamental stage? So this is the stage over there, which is pretty much the stage that is very, very crucial in supporting and allowing for the specialized movement phase to further flourish in order to achieve lifelong daily living, lifelong recreational living, and lifelong competitive living. So if it is the third fundamental stage in our mountain, we can actually see that it is also the third stage of climbing. However, this is one of the most important stages, and with the mountain of motor development, here the mountain of motor development in terms of these fundamental patterns state that if an individual hasn't been able to reach those fundamental skills, the individual can always go back a few steps, gain better strength at least, so that that strength is utilized to gain the next stage of the mountain easily with a lot of more strength instead of more struggle and more difficulty. So on one hand, Gallahue states that failure to offer opportunities makes it extremely difficult for an individual to achieve proficiency in fundamental movement skills, which will inhibit further application development in specialized movement phase, so that there is proficiency barriers between the fundamental movement skills and their companion specialized sports skills. However, on the other hand, Clark and Metcalfe suggest that fundamental motor skills provide the base camp to the mountain of motor development, leading to motor skillfulness. So this is the only difference in between the hourglass and the mountain development approach, in that Gallahue and his Hourglass states that if those fundamental skills have not been adequately addressed, it becomes more and more and more difficult for those skills to be repaired, right? And to therefore increase better specialized development in the specialized movement phase. However, the mountain says, we disagree, because if there is a problem in the fundamental motor patterns, nothing stops the individual to delay or slow the traveling up the next stage of the mountain, but to spend more time at that stage to better those skills so that there is greater strength, using that greater strength to climb the next stage. So that is the only difference between the fundamental motor patterns and the fundamental phase between the hourglass and the mountain model. So once we have a good skill base in the base camp, which is the fundamental motor pattern acquisition, we then move into a more context-specific period. All right? And this is this lighter gray area. Now the getting onto the peak of the mountain. And once the individual has arrived at the base camp of movement and has established a solid repertoire of fundamental movement skills, no matter how long it is required, opportunities arise for expanding the movement repertoire into more varied and advanced movements by combining and varying the fundamental movement patterns in order to adapt into new and different movement situations. Because movement can take on so many different forms at this time of life, the mountain of motor development begins to split into several different peaks. The peaks that I'm referring to are those peaks that you are seeing here. Right? Here we can see that we've got 4 peaks. Right? So because movement can take on so many new and different forms at this time of life, the mountain of motor developments begin to split into different peaks, which I've shown you, and each leads to the apex of development for different movement skills. And so individuals may begin to branch off onto other peaks, okay, right, or even seek to climb several. Okay, so you can have another peak that is just next to this peak and pretty much at the same height level. As they experiment with different kinds of movement, they have not decided which ones, if any, they will want to pursue on a longer term basis, or if they would like to try and develop further skills, even to excel. So an individual may practice in some activities for several years, thus ascending several different peaks on the mountain until they decide that one of these sports is his favorite, and that is where he wants to dedicate his time and effort to. Thus, he will descend one or more of the peaks as he continues to ascend to another. What do we mean by that? So if the individual once is here, and there are many peaks in this particular peak, however, he finds that, I have an interest and I want to actually try out something new. The individual, of course, needs to descend, all right, at a basis where the individual can get to another type of sport, another type of recreational activity that the individual wants to pursue in life. And therefore, there will be a descent, lowering, so that the individual goes back to the space where that space would give him again, going back to the base camp, and from the base camp then to transitioning to another peak. So the individual may achieve considerable height on a climb up the mountain, all right, but if those interests differ, the individual will need to go back or climb a little bit lower to return to the lower levels before again he reaches another peak. Perhaps the individual can leave one peak altogether as they begin to ascend up another, and this period is one that is experienced by most of us, if not all of us, because we tend to try new things, get an experience, but then we want to encourage that experience to branch out to other experiences. And sometimes we need to begin at a particular base in order for us to adequately climb up the new experiences that we want to envision, to enlighten, to achieve, to savor, to understand, and to undergo. And so it seems like Clark and Metcalfe implicitly referred to the two levels of specialized movements in our hourglass model, including the transfer and the application, by expressing that individuals may participate in some activities for several years, thus ascending several different peaks on the mountain, until he or she decides that one of these sports is his favorite, and that is where he wants to dedicate his time and effort in. This is because at a transitional stage, individuals, regardless of abilities, are willing to participate in a variety of activities and so on. However, also has chances of success in a few fields, which means to climb to several peaks until, based on the interests and the ability preferences of a particular sport and the works in it, which is the application stage. So during the application stage, individuals begin to seek out or to avoid participation in specific activities because they want to center themselves around the activity or the activities that they want to focus on, and to narrow down the remaining or to remove the remaining activities. So increased emphasis is placed on form, skill, accuracy, and the quantitative aspects of movement performance. This is a time for more complex skills to be refined and used in advanced games, leading up activities, and selected sport or recreational activities. Right, so the process of application and transition, all right, is here. However, the peak is where we move into the skillful period. And the goal of this period is the achievement of skillful, experienced, specialized professional behaviors. And so the attainment of the skillful period of development requires both experience and a lot of practice. And this level of motor development is also influenced by the previous period, whereby having a broad-based and well-developed supply of movement skills will assist in the development of higher levels of skill in this particular period. And so this skillful period is not achieved by all, and it is intentional. Pretty much what is known as a level of attainment based on months or years of dedication towards becoming proficient and skilled in one or more areas of our development. So having achieved this period is indicative of some degree of proficiency in a specific movement, skill, or skills. So the attainment of this higher level of proficiency or expertise is often assessed by one's ability to perform the movements involved with less concentration and enabling the performer to instead pay more attention to the strategies and adaptations of moving during the performance. So these high levels of proficiency in movement are attained or obtained through greater motivation to excel. And this is a psychological component. Again, remember we were speaking about the hereditary and the environmental aspect. Is the individual still feeling motivated enough to continue this pursuit? And so those buckets are still pouring in if we look at it from an hourglass approach. So that motivation may come from one's family, the childhood, the neighborhood, or the cultural background, which was the other bucket, which was the environment-based bucket. It may, however, arise out of geographic or peer pressure or incentives that ultimately affect one's interest level, amount and quality of coaching or instruction, and of course practice. So given that in the fifth period of the Clark and Metcalfe's mountain motor development, it is argued that the attainment of the skillful period of development requires both experience and practice, and factors such as physiological factors and personal motivation, those two buckets that we had in the hourglass model. It seems like the skillful period in the mountain motor development is pretty much equal to the lifelong utilization stage in the hourglass model and reflects similar concepts, because essentially the lifelong utilization stage represents a culmination of all preceding stages and phases, as in with Clark and Metcalfe's mountain motor development, which refers to the issue of explicitity. So skillful movement is characterized by efficiency, adaptability, and certainty of outcome. To be skillful, we must move with biomechanical, physiological, and psychological efficiency. While being consistent, the skilled performer must also maintain the adaptability to adjust when conditions change. Very important. So if we have a look at the COVID-19 pandemic, many of our skillful periods have been affected, all right, by one of these buckets, all right, because although we are very much skillful and may have obtained an excellent skill, all right, COVID-19 has affected those levels of professional skills to one degree or another, depending on the other environmental aspects that affect us as well as our own, in terms of our interests, how well we feel in dealing and adapting to the COVID-19 restrictions in order to make sure that we do not lose our skills, or how our skills affected and how has that affected our development as a result of that. So this is pretty much the same. So have we been able to adapt to the conditions, to the restrictions that were posed on our skillfulness? Some yes, some no. Right? So while being consistent, the skilled performers, like ourselves, must be able to maintain the adaptability and to adjust to the conditions changing. This is referring to the stage that is the culmination of all stages and phases, which is the lifelong utilization stage. Now, we then, once we feel that we are at the peak of the mountain, it is not over. And so, although we've reached a particular peak, right, we do enter into a period known as compensation. So whilst we are standing on that peak, we are now entering into what we call compensation. And when we enter into compensation, we usually consider it as a nullifying of or adapting to the effects of some type of negative influences. So think about the COVID-19 pandemic for a little bit here. Clark and Metcalfe note two types of compensation in particular. That of evolving from injury and that evolving from decline seen with aging in middle to late adulthood. So injury can occur at any time throughout life. Now, obviously, we're focusing on motor development. And the effects of injury can be permanent and affect our ability to continue to climb to a higher plateau. In fact, injury often results in regression to a previous period of development or level in the mountain. So because we may be affected by something quite severe and life-changing whilst we're at the peak, right? What usually happens is that we can easily regress and go back into either skillfulness or a little bit lower, depending on the degree of the effect of injury when it comes to motor and physical development. And so we humans are adaptable and we can overcome adversity experience with the injury and resume the climb, often attaining higher levels than ever before. All right. So if we had to think about a saying of this, there's a lovely saying. It says, whatever brings me down makes me stronger to get up. And the same goes for the mountain approach, the mountain theoretical framework. So imagine the plight of an elite athlete who suffers a severe knee injury all of a sudden. Initially, the athlete ceases all participation in the sport and may undergo surgery followed by physical therapy. Right? Slowly, however, she may return to play and she may achieve her former skill level, as may even surpass that level, achieving even better, full and successful compensation than in the beginning. However, she may have been so severely injured that she cannot regain her former ability and may not even be able to return to play at all. So it is an up and down process. So most of the typical declines, such as slowing down, reduction in strength, endurance, flexibility, that occur with aging can be compensated through education, training, and taking on appropriate activities. So in other words, not stopping ourselves from something that may have affected us, all right? But utilizing other resources, although we've gone down a little bit, right, into the lower stage of our mountains. It doesn't mean that we cannot use the resources that are at those lower stages of our mountains for us to even regain better strength and get back on those peaks. Nevertheless, some decline with aging appears to be inevitable, right? And that is a fact. We can, however, adapt to these declines, and often we can overcome them for a period of time. Just like with injury in earlier periods of life, we can adapt to the changes that come with aging, redirect our efforts, and regain a very functional status, despite of what may have taken place. So in other words, we can resume our climb up the mountain, following a return to a lower level, maybe even all the way down to the base camp. Once we have resumed that climb, we may attain heights for a while that we had never actually even attained in the first place. So in short, our motor development during later adulthood does not have to be a slow and systematic decline. It can be repeated with numerous periods of progression. So Clark and Medcliffe in the sixth period of the mountain also have pointed to the part of lifelong utilization in the hourglass model, which is here. Oh, sorry. Let's go back to our initial hourglass. There we go. Which is this part. Okay. So, according to Gallahue, all right, who developed the hourglass model, at some point the hourglass turns over, right? Because we've got so much sand at the lower part that we now need to turn it over and allow the sand to go into the other side. So the timing of this occurrence is variable and often depends more on social and cultural factors than on physical and mechanical factors. So for most individuals, the hourglass turns over and the sand, the stuff of life, through those two buckets, the heredity, individual-based, and the environmental, external-based, begins to pour out during the late teens and early 20s for various reasons, such as work, occupations, or lack of physical activity. So time restrictions limit the pursuit of new movement skills and the maintenance of skills mastered during childhood and adolescence. So although we can never stop sand from flowing to the bottom of our hourglasses, we can slow down the rate at which it falls. We can directly influence how fast sand falls through our hourglasses. So as teachers, coaches, therapists, and parents, we have the wonderful opportunity to shovel sand into many hourglasses. We also have the privilege and obligation to help others develop lifestyle filters that will slow the rate at which the sand fills in our hourglasses. Sand can still be added even when the hourglasses are overturned and the sand is falling and continues to fall at the bottom. Each of us has lifelong opportunities for learning, and by taking advantage of the numerous opportunities for continued development and growth and physical activity, we can add more sand and improve the quality of life. So what I have done for you is I've pretty much taken a table for us and have pretty much matched Gallahue's hourglass model, right, to the model of the mountain of motor development, just to give you an indication in terms of, if we look at the reflexive movement phase, we know that there are two stages, and this reflexive movement phase with the two stages according to the hourglass pretty much reflects the reflexive period according to the mountain of motor development. And the same with the rudimentary movement phase. We have the reflex inhibition stage, precontrol, and initial stage, right? Okay, and these stages make up the rudimentary movement phase of the hourglass, which pretty much refer to and are similarly aligned to the pre-adapted period of our mountain. And the same with the fundamental and specialized phases, and those of the fundamental patterns period in the mountain as well as the skillful compensation period. Right, so you're welcome to utilize this table to align the stages and the phases according to and how they link to one another. All right, by matching them with one another. So in conclusion, we for a fact know that motor skills are extremely important for our learners' development. Everything infants do involves motor skills, from posture to locomotion to manual actions, particularly whether they are involuntary or when they move into now better voluntary movements, exploratory actions, social interactions, and actions with and movements with artifacts. Put in another word, or in other words, all behavior is motor behavior, and thus motor skill acquisition is synonymous with behavioral development and goes hand in hand. Age norms for basic motor skills provide useful diagnostics for typical development, just like our Hourglass does. But cultural differences in child-rearing practices influence skill onset ages, which focuses more on the flexibility of development, just like our mountain metaphor framework actually focuses on. And whenever they emerge, motor skills lay the function for development by opening up new opportunities for learning. So motor skills can instigate a cascade of developments in domains far afield from motor behavior: perception, cognition, language, communication, emotional expression, regulation, growth, health, and so on. But motor skill acquisition makes behavior emotional flexible. And that is the biggest essence behind motor development and behavior. Right. Thank you, everybody. This was all for today. Please take note that this is the essential component of motor development, and you need to be very well aware of how motor development takes place. And these are the two systematic theories that gives us a very good indication of how we can keep track of motor development. Remember, not isolating it in stages, but being open to the fact that there is the environment, there is the innate self that play a huge role in the development and the pace of these, and for us to make sure that to understand that yes, we have age norms and stages that we need to motor development in particular, but to also be well aware that we do not impose pressure on these stages of development to take place in isolation. So keeping in mind that apart from having a good indication for age-based development of motor development, we need to be more open-minded and to be patient with our learners, particularly those that might perhaps be showing a little bit of a delay in these stages of motor development. And to keep in mind and triangulate and be able to put that still into the Hourglass model, but making sure that each and every single one of our learners makes their climb to the top of their mountain in a different phase according to factors such as individual factors as well as external, which are the environments. And although these buckets constantly pour sand into our learners' hourglasses, we can control that, and we can be patient, and we are able to control that sand, or those sands coming in.